All right, so this is America in Transition. This is our next section in a small little unit. So we're still in the Gilded Age, don't get me wrong, but let's talk a little bit more about that. Big part of the Gilded Age makes America so different from here on out is urbanization. People are going to move from the countryside, rural areas, to the urban areas. Um, we call this movement urbanization. Very clever, right? And that's important to know for any test, any state test. Just make sure you know that key term. Just some background that help you appreciate and understand what I'm talking about here is 40% of Americans live in cities by 1900. By 1920, it will be the first time in history of more Americans live in cities than in rural areas. So we see a big change in 20 years. And ever since 1920, we're always going to have more Americans in major cities. Part of that is, of course, factories, right? We talked about in the last section how factories, industries happening in these major cities, creating jobs, attracting people, not just immigrants, but people from the rural areas. But also keep in mind the technology that's developing in agriculture. Perfect example here is Cyrus McCormick's reaper, his mechanical reaper. Imagine how many men it takes and how many days, hours to do a field of wheat with this, with the old sickle saw right here, cutting nonstop. Cyrus McCormick comes up with a mechanical reaper. It's a system of pulleys and pulled by horses itself, where two people, it just takes two people can do as much work in a lot less time than a whole field of people doing the old manual way. So there's less need for workers in the rural areas. So think about that. If you're a farmer with like 8 kids, not all 8 are going to stick around and get the farm. Some of those are going to move to the city areas. And then just think of how much it blows up once you actually get like mechanics with engines and motors and how tractors would change that too. So not only was there attraction to the cities with the factories, but there's a push too. People are going away from the countryside. There's no need for those excessive amount of jobs, and the Reaper is a perfect example of that. So here, I just want to show you guys a couple quick graphs that really explain the increase so fast. So this is 1880, and when we see the brown states like Massachusetts here, right, and a couple other ones, Rhode Island, um, over 60% of people in that state are living in a city. So you can see that's a lot of people in Massachusetts. Most of them live in cities. 60% of them live in cities. You go to a little bit louder, you see 40 to 60, which is more like 50%, right? So about half the people in these states live in cities. Now, that's 1880, right? Fast forward to 1900, or not, sorry, 1920, and you see the huge change. Look how many states have more than 60% of people live in the cities. How many more have 40 to 60%? About half of the people live in the cities. 1880 to 1920, huge jump, not just in population naturally, but immigration as well. And those major cities are where the factories are at. That's where the jobs are at. That's where everybody's flooding to. But the problems with those cities and urbanization itself, there's four big areas we actually look at when we take a look at this. The number one thing, and you gotta know this term, are tenements. All right. Imagine a imagine the largest room in your house or largest room you've been in, maybe a classroom size, but that's the entire apartment. And a huge family shares it, maybe multiple families shares it. There's no bathroom at all. There's no ventilation. There's no windows. There's no fire escape. There's a stove in there to cook from, and that's it. Um, at this point in time, there's no government regulation. There's no reason to have a fire escape. There's no reason why you would make indoor plumbing. These immigrants are coming in, they're getting to what they can afford. They come from poor areas. They barely can make it over, and now they're coming in. And if you're a landlord building an apartment building, you're not going to put all the extra stuff in. It's way cheaper just to put all brick and no windows. It's way cheaper to do that and then have a room inside the middle of the building so you can squeeze a whole nother apartment in there with no windows whatsoever and one exit, entrance and exit. There's no government. You have to know plumbing. You have to have ventilation. Things are pretty bad. People are dying during the summertime. People, if they have to use a restroom, they use a bucket in the corner and take it downstairs and throw it in the street. There's not even a sewage system in many of these big cities yet. There's definitely no garbage man. because garbage man, that's a government entity. Like that's your local government is paying for it. Your city council, city government is paying for the garbage man. They get it from your taxes, but they're not providing that service for you at all. So things are pretty bad. Those tenements are pretty harsh and pretty terrible to live in. And like I already pointed this out, the bad public service, like at poor garbage man, there's few police. Transportation is a huge issue as well. As a matter of fact, New York, that's actually why they start building a subway, because the pollution and trash left behind from trolleys and horses, as you can see here, is pretty ridiculous, right? Um, this is just like there's no rules against livestock in the city. So if a cow died in the city, if I was a farmer and my cow died in the city, I'm not going to go get it. One thing, if you ever try picked up, if you could pick up a cow, you should not be a farmer. You should be Mr. Universe because you're really strong. But that was an issue as well. As you see, kids with no school, nothing to do, playing side by side a dead animal. We know now that's pretty unhealthy. But then it was just not looked at. Overcrowding, that's pretty much tells you obviously with the tenements, social tensions. Most textbooks point this out that when you have these poor tenement buildings and people living in it, and then right around the corner you had somebody wealthy, when their house was the size of your whole entire tenant building, it created social tension. You know, it's the have and have-nots. Um, that's an argument I think you can make. Even nowadays, we see that and we see have and have-nots, but it doesn't seem to bother us as much. It's interesting how we look at that. And then finally, we got to talk about one particular man himself. I want to make sure everybody knows this is Jacob Riis, photographer who is going to go around these slums, these tenement homes. These are actually his pictures here, and he'll bust in, take a picture, take these pictures, and now he's got this technology where they have a flash, like it really looks like a gun. He fires his gun, it flashes, and he exposes the camera film. And at nighttime, he can take pictures just like this. That's an entire tenement home right there. Whole family shares that and lives in there with a stove in a corner. So you take these pictures and it shows how bad life really is for a lot of New Yorkers. Takes it to newspapers. He says, want you to print this. I want people to see it. And newspapers say, we can't do that. It's horrible conditions. It's embarrassing. Nobody's going to buy the paper if we do that. So Jacob Riis decides he's going to take matters into his own hands. He actually hosts a slideshow presentation, invites the wealthy people of New York to come see what he says, how the other half lives. So what he calls it. Because he says, you guys don't know this, but this is actually going on right around the corner from you. And these wealthy people they're appalled. Some of these are middle class, some of these are wealthy people. They're appalled by what they see. And when we see changes, it's actually not poor people demanding changes. It's usually the middle class or wealthy Christians who say, this is our job, this is our duty to help the poor people. And in doing so, they're going to say they're going to expect the government to do something about it. The government can say, hey, you must have indoor plumbing if you're going to be a landlord. You must have a fire escape so people don't die and burn up in a building. Add a window so people can breathe and not suffocate to death. Things like that. Jacob Riis actually ends up publishing a book called How the Other Half Lives, exposing the ills of society. We call that a muckraker. I'll talk about it in the next section, progressive error, but he's just one of many muckrakers that we see through this time period. Along with urbanization at the time, we see a lot of corruption. I want you to make sure you understand a couple of terms you might see. Firstly, we do have political machines. This is kind of confusing for students, but just to make it simple, I'm going to try to simplify this the best I can. And major cities at the time, and this is very common, had a group of politicians that controlled everything from the way public services were distributed, if there were any, to voting, how people voted, what people voted, to how taxpayer money was spent. A group of politicians is called a political machine. Sometimes, depends on the city, like here we're talking about New York, and we talk about New York a lot. And New York is a perfect example in this whole chapter of cities during Gilded Age. But New York particularly had one person in charge of the political machine. Those guys are called bosses. In New York, his name was Boss Tweed. And City Hall was nicknamed Tammany Hall in New York City. So Boss Tweed was head of Tammany Hall in New York City. Now, these guys or politicians they're pretty corrupt. They take bribes, and they actually kind of what I call skim off the top of taxpayer money. So here's my example. All right, so Boss Tweed, he comes along and says, hey, I need the bathroom remodeled in the city hall. Okay, person A comes along and says, hey, I can do it for 5K, 5,000 bucks. That's pretty good. Person B comes along and says, I can do it for 10K. A third person comes along and says, my quote for you is 20K. So Boss Tweed has to look at these three and decide which one am I going to go with here. And in modern times, obviously, the cities would take quotes and they pick the lowest quote for the best deal, right? So y'all can do the same job, you go with the lowest quote. Common sense, right? But um, Boss Tweed decides, I'm going to go with number 20K. And in doing so, that happens to be a good friend of his. And a good friend knows I'm going to put in 20K bid. Why does Boss Tweed do this? Well, Boss Tweed is going to pay his friend that 20K. In return, his friend will give him 10K to put in his own personal pocket. Remember, Boss Tweed isn't paying for this remodel himself, the taxpayers are. So it's a win-win. Boss Tweed's good friend still gets 10K for a cheap, simple job. That should be half of it. Boss Tweed pockets 10K in his pocket and becomes that much richer. Nobody suffers except the taxpayers. All your money's going out the window. Now he did this stuff. People knew about it, and people were starting to write about it left and right. But Boss Tweed's main constituents are immigrants coming over. As they come in over in hundreds and thousands, sometimes per day, he's getting them jobs, getting food, getting them located. They actually like the guy. He's bribing them for their votes and stuff like that. But he's bribing. They like the guy, and in doing so, they see these pictures. They can't read English. A lot of these guys from Italy or Eastern Europe, Southern and Eastern Europe, they can't read English, so the newspapers don't bother them except when they see these pictures. And you can imagine if you're an immigrant coming over and you see this picture of Boss Tweed, and you're like, why is Boss Tweed dressed with a money sack on his head? Why does he look so crooked here at the ballot and counting their strength? What does that mean? What's going on? And if an immigrant, somebody who doesn't speak or read English, will ask somebody who does or somebody who knows what's going on, it gets them talking, and the people say, "Hey, look, he's bribing. It's all about money, who he picks for his appointments, things like that. He is doing quite a bit of voter fraud, I guess you could say, for lack of better terms, to compare to modern times. Sorry, they're going to make that argument. They're going to tell them that's what's going on in the story. And Boss Tweed knew that. It was huge for him. Look at this quote he had: "Stop them damn pictures. I don't care what the papers write about me. My constituents can't read, but damn it, they can see pictures." Eventually, that would be downfall of Boss Tweed. He'll be worn out, will be put out for his arrest. Once all this goes public enough that there's charges brought up against him, he'll flee to Spain. And even 100 years ago, Spain would extradite him back to New York, where he'll face those charges. But nonetheless, Boss Tweed of Tammany Hall, he's just one of many political machines that exist at the time. Again, corruption ran rapid, and there's got to have consequences and laws to stop that, and the government needs to step in. Okay, so people are flooding to cities, and not just from rural areas. Immigration is huge. There's a couple of things you should know about immigration in general. Um, First, there are push factors and pull factors. Okay, but let's keep it simple. Hold on. Push and pull factors. Let's start with push factors. Push factors are things that push people away from a country. So it's the negatives. Think of things like war, poverty. There's poor economics, no jobs, the economy itself, right? Oppression, is the government attacking you. There's plenty of examples across the world that we see even now. People are being oppressed because of their religious beliefs, which could be religious persecution, ethnic persecution, push people away from that country. Millions of Jewish people tried to leave Germany during the 1930s, but were unable to do so. So just like perfect examples of push factors. And it could be other stuff. I make the argument that some people will leave a country because it doesn't have good health care. I mean, that's common as well. Or a bad education, which brings me to this concept of pull factors that pull you to a country, right? What if you can't get an education in the other country? Wouldn't you risk life for your own life, for your kids, better education and a better future? Freedoms. Keep in mind, what pulls people to America is the idea of freedoms. And you can't say what you want in Russia, even to this day in so-called democracy. If you're anti-government, you can't be silenced and put in prison. China is worse, and North Korea is the most strongest example of the lacks of freedom. Economic opportunities, if there's jobs available, a steady economy, people do go to that area. Um, Across the Atlantic, in Europe, or it's Europe. People flood to Europe. Over here, people flood to the United States. We see a lot of economic opportunities and cultural ties. That's one we don't talk about much. Is similarly speaking, some people will migrate to areas with the same culture, which I'm going to address that in actually just a second when we talk about immigration as a whole. But what you definitely need to know, gotta know this for the STAAR test, is where these new immigrants are coming from. Quotes, new, right? There are old immigrants that have been here, right? We're talking about 1800. America's been a country for 120 some odd years. So we've had these old immigrants coming in. Now we've got these new immigrants coming in. The old ones, they're coming from more of Western Europe, right? Like France, Great Britain, Germany. Okay. These new ones, Star Test wants you to know where they're coming from. These new ones are coming from Southern Europe, like Italy. Make sure you know that Italy's. If you can think of Italy, you'll be okay when it comes to these new immigrants. Italy, and then even East Europe, and even like Greece down here, Austria-Hungary, Czechoslovakia, all these small countries you never heard of that you think's weird. Those are the new immigrants coming from South or Southern and Eastern Europe. Okay, that's make sure you know that. That's they always ask that. South and East, pretty straightforward. And why is this a big deal? If an immigrant's an immigrant, it's not. Definitely not. Think about this. The older immigrants from the west half of Europe, Great Britain, France, and Germany, those guys are Protestant, which is essentially a Christian that's not Catholic. Versus the new ones coming from East. Remember, Vatican City is in Italy. That's like home to millions of Catholics. Even on Eastern Europe, that's Orthodox Christianity, not the same thing. And Jewish people as well. Um, the new immigrants were more likely to be illiterate. I mean, they can't read, unskilled, peasants pretty much, barely able to make it over. Those coming from Germany, France, and Great Britain, they were literate and skilled, even if it's carpentry, tansmith, blacksmith, whatever you can think of. Those Western European peoples had skills and were often literate, um, and they actually had money. Like people from Germany came to America, didn't like it, and turned around and came back. So the people in the West had a good from West Europe here had a good chunk of money to begin with, versus those over here in East and Southeast were very poor, could barely make the trip over. Okay, some huge differences. What even made it worse was this idea of assimilation. Italians were less likely to assimilate. Eastern Europe's less likely to assimilate, um, and part of that is the language and the cultural differences. If you're from Italy and you come over to New York, you're going to live with people who speak the same languages, who have the same denomination, Christianity, specifically Catholic, same culture, same food. So you're going to move and be with them and be with each other. So you're never actually going to assimilate and force yourself to be American, right? It's impossible. It's like breaking an invisible barrier. So those guys would get together and especially New York, and we'll end up calling that Little Italy because there's so many Italians in that area. It was the same for all these new immigrants. You're going to stick to what you know, people you know, languages you can speak. And another one is a backstory that a lot of people forget about is the countries they come from and their political systems. You look at these countries, you talk about Great Britain, monarchy with a prime minister and some form of democracy, France with a slight form of democracy. Western Europe's governments were at least established, right? Let's say that at the very least. Over here in the South and the East, these are pretty much like kingdoms. There wasn't a real government whatsoever. So people looked at these new immigrants and they had this idea that these people were coming from countries of lawlessness, no government whatsoever. They looked at them like they want that here. They're probably anarchists. They're trying to overthrow any government we have altogether. So these new immigrants from South and Eastern Europe, were treated and looked differently by these old immigrants. And they were different, and it plays a big role in the long run of how immigrants react, and even immigration laws. The trip for most immigrants coming from Europe put them right into New York City. It's like a main hub. And as they came into New York City, they would pass the Statue of Liberty once it's built and come to Ellis Island. There, they would be asked a series of questions as they wait in line for a little bit, asked a series of questions, and they were silly questions. Are you sick? No. Good. Are you a criminal? No. Okay. Good. Do you have any affiliation with anarchists or anti-communists? Anything? No, 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 no. I'm fine. I'm fine. Okay, you're in. Rarely in New York City at Ellis Island were these people like held overnight for anything. Totally different story if you go to California, who dealt with Asian immigration off the island, off this coast, and at an island called Angel Island. There, they stripped Asians down, checked them, inspected them, embarrassed them, held them overnight many times before they let them come into California. And since the core beginning, we've treated Asians quite differently, and we talk more about that when we talk about World War II. But nonetheless, Europeans will go through Ellis Island, and many times when they get through, they, like I said earlier, they're going to stick with their same people. Italians going to live with Italians and create what we call Little Italy. The Chinese who do make it to New York and other there's a Chinatown. They have a Chinatown, and there's a Chinatown in every major city. Vancouver has the second largest Chinatown in North America. Even right outside, close to us, is Houston. There's a Chinatown in Houston, although it has a huge population of Vietnamese. As a matter of fact, in Chinatown, you'll see street signs in Chinese, Vietnamese, and English. Um, there's a huge Vietnamese population, and that comes from Vietnam War, not until 1970s. But nonetheless, people end up living in neighborhoods with people they're familiar with, and these places get a nickname. Ethnic ghettos is what they're called. A ghetto sounds like a negative word, and it wasn't always used negative. It's usually used to describe a specific neighborhood. And this case is based on ethnicity. So just understand that concept itself. Okay, when we're talking about immigration, it's important that we understand that the views that we see in modern times aren't always the same ones that existed throughout the United States history. Immigration needs to be seen differently. There was an expectation that these people become Americanized, meaning they learn to dress, speak, and act like other Americans. Same traditions, say the Pledge of Allegiance, learn English, right? That was always kind of expected, the idea of becoming Americanized, act American. Now, if you hear the word assimilate, that's very similar in the fact that I assimilated to that culture. I assimilated to America. I became Americanized. But if you see the word assimilate, it could apply to other countries, other cultures as well. For instance, I assimilate to Hispanic culture. I celebrate the same traditions and holidays. That's what I do now. Follow because so you can assimilate other cultures, but if I say Americanized, I'm specifically talking about assimilating to the American ideology, and that's what people expected immigrants to do as far back. But however, immigration was seen as a positive thing in U.S. history. People considered um, us a melting pot, if you will. It's kind of interesting, but the idea of a melting pot that Americans, we all were little bits of a recipe, if you will. One culture was the salt, one culture was the pepper, one was the fruit, one was the water. And mix it all together, and you have this unique melting pot. Together, we're much better, right, than we are as ingredients separate. This is a giant melting pot, and this is America. Um, it wasn't always seen as we see now that we're so different, vastly different. And people have argued that. Like nowadays, people do argue that we're a salad. Your croutons, somebody else's lettuce, another culture's tomatoes. We never mix. We're just stuck together, unfortunately. I think that's up for debate, but historically, we've seen it as a melting pot and has immigration has been a positive thing, taking the best from every culture. It's only recently how people really discuss that and attack the concept altogether. But a best way to Americanize these immigrants, we found it was best at schools. All right, you just think about what's the best way to get you to learn English. Put you in a classroom with 29 other people who speak English. Best way to make you dress a certain way. put you in a classroom with 29 other people who dress a certain way. It's Pledge of Allegiance every day. I don't want to say it's brainwashing or anything like that, but again, what better way to become Americanized and teach you from when you're very young. Now, this anti-immigrant ideology does rear its head again. We talked about this before, but nativism, Irish Catholics were the first one to suffer that, but never was a law passed against Irish Catholics. Nativism never grew that big. It's interesting. However, when people start treating Chinese immigrants back in California, and they start actually having rallies, and they actually beat up Chinese innocent bystanders, the racism in California increases a great deal. That California representatives are able to convince all United States federal government to pass immigration laws against the Chinese, creating the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. It's the first immigration law in the United States, and it targeted Chinese, and they couldn't come over anymore. It's mind-boggling. The only people that are affected was China or was California, and even then, somehow they convinced all of America to be scared of China. Man, they're bringing opiates, and drugs, and they're going to rape our women. They had them convinced that. It's mind-boggling how that works. It's interesting because if you actually take a look at the political cartoons at the time, even they point out how ridiculous it is. Golden Gate of Liberty plays on Golden Gate Bridge, plays on Golden Gate being San Francisco, California. The Chinese are not allowed in, even though they bring industry, even though they are order, even though peace and sobriety is a big thing, is important for them. They're not in. But communist, socialist hoodlums, the worst of the worst people are allowed in. And it says the only one barred out is the Chinese. So even political cartoons at the time knew how absolutely ridiculous this whole concept was to just target this group of people and only this group of people. And if you're wondering if the Chinese Exclusion Act worked, from 1882 when it was enacted up until 1920, it was still going on. If you look at the number of foreign-born people inside of the United States, way over here, you have Asia. And that's all of Asia. The U.S. government and Chinese government worked together to make sure that Chinese people did not break the law and come over in huge numbers, if at all. Now, there's been several gold rushes throughout U.S. history. The first one everybody thinks of is the California Gold Rush. That's a different time period. Our time period is right after that. And there is an important one called the Klondike Gold Rush, not to be confused with the Klondike bar with the polar bear on it. That delicious snack can help you remember where the Klondike takes place. It's actually in Alaska. And just like any other gold rush, hundreds of people were set out, 100,000 people set out to Alaska for this gold rush. 30,000 make it, meaning that 70,000 people realize Alaska is really far away. It's just like any other gold rush, and the fact that it does really bring lots of people to Alaska. Migration, gold rushes and mineral rushes do play a role in migration. Whether you realize or not, you can migrate within a country. This also really does kick off a mass search for gold and silver everywhere in the United States, even in the Rocky Mountains, where we're going to see a lot of silver. And some people are already there, Native Americans, and we're going to push them off. Americans are going to push off the Native Americans and want more of that land. And we see a lot more Indian wars during this time period than ever before. But we won't go into too much detail on that. But it's pretty horrific what happens, even from the Battle of Little Bighorn, for instance, and even the slaughter that happens in that case. Now, the last American frontier is what we're dealing with. As Native Americans are pushed off their land, this is the last of it. And the U.S. Army actually giving orders to shoot herds and herds of buffalo. They would get on trains, see a herd of buffalo, stop the train, get out, shoot, wipe out the buffalo in hopes that they were wiping out the food source for Native Americans. There's been a popular debate in modern times that once the Native Americans were introduced to the horse, they would essentially wipe out the buffalo themselves. But that's a debate that can go on and on with what ifs. But nonetheless, that's how the U.S. Government took it. Whatever they do to push the Native Americans off this land and onto reservation land. Now, you see from this picture, these people did not leave those buffaloes in the field. Buffalo hide was very valuable in the East, all the way back in New York and in those factories, because before rubber, before plastics, you had hide. Leather hide was used, leather belts were used to actually operate machinery instead of rubber belts. So there was a big need for buffalo in general. Down here, you can actually see the skulls of buffalo. There's pictures like that do exist. That's why I don't agree with the idea that Native Americans, because they had horses, would have done that. I don't think they could do that. It was just horses. I think it takes railroad and a lot of men with guns. Now, the Homestead Act. Make sure you know this. The Homestead Act was passed by Congress in 1862 during the Civil War, which means that the Southern Democrats weren't even there. So Republicans up north passed it, and they passed this law that says any citizen is given a 160-acre land grant for 5 years. So any citizen can apply for this, and they're given 160 acres free, a grant, free for 5 years. And if it's improved upon, they now own it. And you can improve upon land by building a house. Boom, you improved it, it's yours now. That's how desperate they were to get Americans out there. They're giving away free land. And I point out, hey, this was done during the Civil War by the North, so you can see that this applied to any citizen, including freed slaves. And you can see that from this picture here. Life was tough. There's not water in the Great Plains, it's Great Plains. And if you see back here, you can actually see a water windmill that they use to pull the water from the ground, because there are giant aquifers in the Great Plains underground. But that was a new type of technology of the time. Now take a look at these homes that they have. They're not made of trees. Here's a big one for you guys. They're not made of trees. They're made of dirt. Right? When people got to the Great Plains, they realized, hey, these are called the Great Plains because it's a bunch of plains. There are no trees for wood. How do I build my house? They're going to mix grass, mud. They get baked in the sun, much like adobe, and they're going to build homes. So they do get some wood eventually brought in. They do plant some trees. Some people, once they got there, the only thing they can make their home out of, their doors out of, was a wagon that they just brought everything in on. So these were called sod houses, S-O-D. You know what? Let me put that in a different color so you guys can see it clearly. I want you guys to make sure you know this. S-O-D, sod houses. The dirt is another word for dirt. Sod is usually a mixture of there's types of dirt. If you go to this Lowe's or Home Depot, you don't buy dirt in a bag, you buy sod. It's really unfair that state tests ask you like that, because if you're not a gardener, you wouldn't know that. But they're sod houses. All right, the last American frontier, those railroads, it's not just going to be the railroads that close it down and Native Americans push off to reservations. At one point in time in history, there were no railroads that lead down to Texas. You can look at this map here. The dot here, here's a railroad. Here's several roads that run from it and across all the way east to west. This was the Church County Railroad. But people realized there's a lot of money could be made. You see, out New York and in the East, people wanted steak, right? But there's not a lot of land out there, so you don't have a lot of cattle. But you can make a lot of money if you're a cowboy here in Texas, and you and a handful of guys took a few hundred heads of cattle, of this inbred cattle, this ugly thing called a longhorn, and push it all the way up, push hundreds of them at a time, all the way up to these train stations, and get them out to the east. You could make a ton of money. Now, usually you had a middleman, like you got him up there, the middleman took care of it. He paid you, and you can make a ton of money. Just a handful of your guys can make money on these cattle drives. If you get a chance, you should watch the movie Open Range. It's a perfect example of some of the last ones that do it. There's a couple of pictures from it. But just a handful of guys and hundreds of heads of cattle meant a big payday. It's interesting because at the time, 1 in 5 cowboys are actually African American. The idea of cowboys actually comes from Mexico. It's not an American thing at all. Keep that in mind. Western music eventually became country Western music. It came from bluegrass with African American roots mixed with a little storyline. Instead of just playing bluegrass music, you add a story to it and you have country Western music. Now, what stopped all this? Number one thing was railroad. Farmers were sick, absolutely sick of these guys coming through their land, tearing down their fence, and just eating the grass and going on, destroying the land just to get all the way up here to the railroads. People were sick of that. One rancher comes up with the idea of a wired, he uses his wife's actually loom to sew with and creates barbed wire. And that pretty much is what's going to work. All other fences didn't work. It took barbed wire, and that's going to stop cattle. That's actually why there's supposedly old law in Texas that you can't have pliers carried on you. So technically, pliers are illegal. Back then, they made that law because you would cut the wire. So it was a law that you couldn't have pliers carrying about with you on your person. But people have said that that means you can't have it in your glove box in your truck either, and that's illegal. But that's a interpretation, isn't it? Also, it does help when railroads come all the way down to Fort Worth, especially Fort Worth. Once a railroad gets down here, why would you go all the way up to Nebraska and Kansas? If you're anywhere in Texas with cattle, you should get them to Fort Worth, and then it hops on a train, and eventually they go wherever you need to go. That's why Dallas, Fort Worth, it's considered cow towns, right? Dallas Cowboys, etc. That's exactly why it is, because the railroads and barbed wire are going to kill the whole concept of the cattle drive. Now, the government policy towards Native Americans, it's pretty consistent, right? Forceful removal, constantly pushing, pushing, pushing. Then you got the ass of the Indian Wars, 1860 to 1890, pushing even more and taking more territory. You're going to destroy their environment, roads, mines for the gold and silver, and even tear down and make flat lands like farming. That is the way Americans are going to treat the Native Americans and put them on reservations, which isn't exactly the best land. You can actually see like the Four Corners, that's a desert. That's not the best land. As a matter of fact, Native Americans aren't even considered citizens until 1924 by the American Indian Citizenship Act. This guy right here, this old white dude right here wearing an Indian that looks like he's like stealing culture, that's President Coolidge. He's actually going to pass that and give them citizenship in 1924 because technically they weren't citizens at all. Even if they were born in the United States, they weren't considered citizens. Um, the solution to that before they finally gave in and passed the American Indian Citizens Act in 1924, the federal government had tried something else. They tried the Dawes Act. This act, again, gave 160 acres to Native Americans. Each family member, they would take the reservation, divide it up in little plots of 160 acres each. Each family got 160 acres, and if they farmed the land, they got citizenship. You see what they were trying to do? The government was trying to Americanize Native Americans and make them all like farmers. But it didn't work out too well for a couple things. One, the land sucked. It was infertile land. It was horrible. Many Native Americans at the time considered themselves hunters, not farmers. They're not used to that lifestyle, so they're not good at it either. Even especially when it's like bad land. And this attempt to assimilate them and make them Americanized, it threatened Native American culture. Like the way things work through the tribe and through the chief and the elders was important for generations and generations, as far back as anybody could remember. So to change all that, it just wasn't going to work. And the reservation life itself on those lands were pretty horrible. Like Native Americans suffered from starving, and even now there's issues with them, especially with COVID going on. Changed everything. But that was the Dawes Act. Make sure you know the Dawes Act. They gave them a chance to have 160 acres and be farmers, but in doing so, you lose your culture altogether to become Americanized. That was the government's attempt. And at first, from 87 to 1924, that was the only way a Native American could become a citizen. Some did take that route and did try.